To understand why 11 states would tear themselves out of the United States and fight a desperate 4-year war that would leave their land in ruins, you have to step inside their world. You have to see what they saw, fear what they feared, and understand what they believed they were defending. In these next episodes, we tell the story of the Civil War from the Southern perspective, not to excuse it, but to understand it, because only then can we grasp the full tragedy of what unfolded. Let me be clear about what we're doing and why. To understand the Confederacy is not to endorse its cause. The South fought ultimately to preserve slavery, a profound and undeniable injustice. But history is not just a list of heroes and villains. It is the study of why real people, in real circumstances, made the choices they made. And the Southern story is one of pride, fear, loyalty, and a tragic blindness. A society that convinced itself it was defending liberty while denying liberty to millions. So let's understand how the South saw its world. By the mid-1800s, the American South had developed into a distinct civilization, deeply different from the North. It was a rural, agricultural society organized around the plantation. And the plantation economy rested entirely on one foundation, the labor of enslaved black people. Cotton was king. The South produced the vast majority of the world's cotton, feeding the textile mills of Britain and the North, generating enormous wealth. And that wealth, that whole way of life, was built on slavery. Now here's something crucial to understand about Southern society. Most white Southerners did not actually own slaves. The majority were small farmers who owned no enslaved people at all. Slavery was concentrated among a relatively small class of wealthy planters. And yet, slavery shaped the entire society, top to bottom. It defined the economy, the social order, and the racial hierarchy that even the poorest white Southerner depended on for his sense of status and place. This is part of why the South would rally so fiercely to defend slavery, even among those who owned no slaves. In a society built on racial slavery, every white person, however poor, stood above every black person. Slavery guaranteed that no matter how low you fell, there was a whole race held beneath you by law and by force. The end of slavery threatened not just the planters' wealth, but the entire social and racial order that ordinary white Southerners had been raised to see as natural and right. So when Southerners looked at the growing anti-slavery movement in the North, they did not see a moral awakening. They saw an existential threat, a threat to their property, their prosperity, their social order, and what they genuinely believed was the natural and even God-ordained arrangement of their world. They had constructed an entire framework of arguments to justify slavery, that it was sanctioned by the Bible, that it was a positive good, that the enslaved were better off than free workers in the North. These were self-serving delusions, but many Southerners believed them sincerely. And this is where we encounter the great euphemism, the phrase Southerners themselves used, and that echoes still, states' rights. The South framed its cause not as a defense of slavery, but as a defense of the rights of the individual states against an overbearing federal government. They argued that the states had voluntarily joined the Union and retained the right to govern their own affairs, and to leave if they chose. It was a constitutional argument dressed in the language of liberty, but we have to be honest about what that states' right was fundamentally about. The specific right the South was defending, again and again, was the right to own slaves and to extend slavery. When Southern states explained their reasons for seceding in their own official declarations, they named slavery explicitly and repeatedly as the central cause. The states' rights they cared about most was the right to maintain human bondage. The principle and the institution were inseparable. To understand the South honestly, we must hold both truths together. They spoke the language of liberty, and they fought to preserve slavery. Now, with that foundation laid, let's understand the South's deepening sense of crisis, its growing fear that it was losing control of its own destiny within the Union. And much of that fear, just as for the North, centered on the Western territories. The great expanding nation was acquiring vast new lands in the West, and the question of every new territory was the same. Would it be slave or free? For the South, this was a matter of survival. Here's why the territories mattered so desperately to the South. Power in the national government, especially in the Senate, depended on the balance between slave states and free states. As long as that balance held, the South could protect slavery from federal interference. But the North was growing faster. More people, more immigrants, more states. If the Western territories all became free states, the South would be permanently outvoted, a shrinking minority, unable to defend its interests. The South would lose control of its own future. So the South fought, politically and fiercely, to expand slavery into the West. Not because every Western farm needed slaves, but because the South needed new slave states to preserve its power in the Union. Each new free state was, to the South, a step toward being overwhelmed and dominated. This is why the battles over Kansas, over the Missouri Compromise, over Dred Scott, were fought with such intensity. They were battles over whether the South would have a future as an equal partner or become a powerless minority. And here, too, the story is tangled up with the conquest of the West and the displacement of native nations. The very lands being fought over were the homelands of Native American peoples, being seized and opened for settlement. The expansion that created the territorial crisis was the same expansion that was destroying native nations. And slavery itself reached into the West. There was an Indian territory where some of the native nations who had been forcibly removed there had themselves adopted slavery and would later ally with the Confederacy. The threads of conquest, slavery, and native dispossession were all woven together. So picture the Southern state of mind through the 1850s. They saw themselves as a proud, distinct people with a prosperous, ordered society, and they saw that society under relentless attack. They saw Northern abolitionists denouncing them as sinners and monsters. They saw the North growing in power and population, threatening to dominate the government. They saw their right to bring slavery into the territories challenged at every turn. They felt surrounded, insulted, and increasingly desperate. And events kept deepening that fear. The violence in bleeding Kansas convinced Southerners that Northerners were willing to use force to keep slavery out of the West. The rise of the purely Northern Republican Party, dedicated to stopping slavery's spread, terrified them. Here was a powerful political movement, with no Southern support at all, openly hostile to their core interest. The South began to feel that it had no real voice, no security, no future within a Union increasingly controlled by its enemies. Then came moments that, to Southern eyes, confirmed their worst fears about the North's true intentions. When the abolitionist John Brown tried to incite a slave uprising at Harper's Ferry in 1859, Southerners were horrified, and even more horrified when much of the North seemed to celebrate him as a martyr. To white Southerners, this was proof that the North wanted not just to limit slavery, but to destroy them, to unleash the nightmare of a violent slave rebellion. Brown's raid sent a wave of fear and fury across the South. From the Southern perspective, the North was becoming a fanatical, hostile power that despised them, threatened their property, endangered their very lives, and was poised to seize control of the government and crush their way of life. They convinced themselves that they were the ones being oppressed, that they, like the patriots of 1776, were defending their liberty and self-government against a tyrannical power. It was a profound and tragic self-deception, casting the defense of slavery as a struggle for freedom. This is one of the great, dark ironies of the Confederate story. The South genuinely came to see itself as the heir to the American Revolution, fighting for the right of self-determination, for liberty against tyranny, for the right of a people to govern themselves. They drew on the language of the founders, of independence and freedom. And yet the liberty they were defending was, at its core, the liberty to hold other human beings in bondage. They could not, or would not, see the contradiction at the heart of their cause. By the late 1850s, then, the South stood coiled and defiant, convinced that it faced a stark choice: submit to a hostile North that would eventually destroy slavery and dominate the South, or resist, even to the point of leaving the Union altogether. The bonds of national loyalty were fraying. Southern fire-eaters, radical secessionists, were openly calling for the South to break away and form its own nation where its way of life would be safe. The unthinkable was becoming thinkable, an event that would convince enough Southerners that the moment had come, that staying in the Union was no longer survivable. And that trigger was approaching. The presidential election of 1860 and the possibility that the hated Republicans with their anti-slavery party might capture the presidency itself entirely without Southern support. To the South, that prospect was nothing less than the end of everything. So as we close this first chapter of the Southern story, hold this picture in your mind: a proud, distinct society built on slavery, convinced it was defending its liberty and its survival against the hostile and growing North. A society that had wrapped the defense of human bondage in the noble language of states' rights and self-government, and had come to believe its own justifications. A society now poised, fearful and defiant, on the edge of a fateful decision. Next time, from the Southern perspective, we'll watch that decision unfold. The election of Lincoln received as a declaration of doom, the dramatic rush to secession, the birth of a new nation, and the agonizing personal choices faced by men like Robert E. Lee, torn between their country and their home. The Confederacy was about to be born in a fever of hope, fear, and tragic conviction.